Pope Leo wrapped up his historic visit to Turkey and Lebanon this week. Not surprisingly, ecumenism and relations with Islam were at the forefront of the trip. Meanwhile, Leo continues reforms at the Vatican Curia. Here with insight and analysis is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Gents, thanks for being here. I have to start with the release of this years-long Vatican study of the female diaconate. 5 years after it started, the Commission has finally released their findings. They ruled that women cannot be admitted to holy orders in this way, and they mention, quote, the masculinity of Christ not being accidental, but an integral part of sacramental identity. Father, as in all these types of documents, there is that little wiggle room they put in there that this is, this needs more study, that somehow it's not definitive. Your take on what this is exactly?
No, this document reflects the fact that they produced a balanced committee to look at the evidence, but that's a function, therefore, of the honesty, I would say, of looking at this question from a historical and theological point of view. Historically, we've never had women deacons, which is an indication that the church didn't think they could do it. And then if you look at the evidence that's given theologically, it comes down to the nature of the incarnation. Christ became incarnate as a man, and then he gave the sacrament of holy orders, the priesthood, the episcopate, and the diaconate to men. The church understood that from the beginning. Therefore, this committee ruled that way. Now, what I like about this document is it confirms what we've always known, because the church has never ordained women as deacons. So that's a good thing. The idea of studying it further, maybe that's just a bureaucratic means of saying people aren't happy about it, stand by. But I think they'll be standing by for a long time.
Yeah, Bob, wasn't it a definitive ruling of the magisterium, sacred scripture, as well as tradition, long before this commission convened, that you couldn't ordain women to any holy orders?
Well, they mention in the document that there are two passionately held theological positions. And obviously, what Father just said is true, that we just know that it's never been the case that women have been ordained to the diaconate. Now, the theological difference they're claiming is that some people say that the diaconate is not one of those stages toward being ordained a priest. And of course, there are permanent deacons, mostly in the United States and in the West more generally. But just because there's a theological difference doesn't mean there can't be a decision made. And I think that what the decision is good. It reaffirms, as I think every truthful study will show, that we simply can't ordain women as deacons. But at the same time, I think it's a political decision. And that slight door that's left open that you mentioned, Raymond, I think that's just there so that people won't be too outraged. But in a way, I think this is inviting further difficulties, because if you said the door is closed, case closed, then it's settled, and that's
Right.
that.
Right.
If you say, well, but we can study this forever, I mean, everybody who's on the other side of this is going to be agitated forever and say, we hope that some year or someday, I've been joking that maybe in 3025, with another millennium of study, maybe they'll come up with a slightly different view. I mean, it's not going to change. It's one of those things that has been settled for so long and lived for so long in the church that I just don't see how you can do anything other than arrive at the conclusions that this committee thankfully arrived at.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot to unpack from Pope Leo's visit to Lebanon and Turkey. Something that struck me, and probably longtime viewers of the show, was this warning that the Pope issued about a new Arianism.
A new Arianism present in today's culture, and sometimes even among believers. This occurs when Jesus is admired on a merely human level, perhaps even with religious respect, yet not truly regarded as the living and true God among us. His divinity, his lordship over history, is overshadowed, and he is reduced to a great historical figure, a wise teacher, or a prophet who fought for justice, but nothing more. Nicaea reminds us that Jesus Christ is not a figure of the past. He is the Son of God, present among us, guiding history toward the future promised by God.
Father, your thoughts on what Leo is getting at here. Why invoke Arianism now?
Well, yes, he invoked it because Arianism was the heresy that was undone by the Council of Nicaea, and that was therefore the wording of the creed is quite clear: light from light, God from God, true. So anyway, but what is also interesting is he said the same thing in his first sermon when he became pope. He said we should not look at Jesus simply as an admirable figure and reduce him to a humanly understandable, super person, but not the Son of God. No, he is the eternal Son of God. That's what I think he wants to remind us of. And we well need that, because it's always a tendency of man, reduce everything to our level so we can master it.
Leo signed a joint declaration, Bob, with Patriarch Bartholomew, celebrating the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. On its face, this seems wonderful. We're commemorating the council that condemned Arianism with our Orthodox brethren. But is there substance here? Is this more than just symbolic? What did the declaration accomplish, Bob?
Well, look, it's always good to agree with a Christian brother. And I think if there's any progress that is going to be made in ecumenism, it's got to be with the Orthodox, because they still have apostolic succession, they have valid sacraments. I mean, during the Cold War, behind the Iron Curtain, Catholics and Orthodox were allowed to worship at each other's churches, because it's really that close. Now, the problem in anything more substantive, if that's what you're asking about, Raymond, is that the Orthodox themselves are not all that united, as we know. The Patriarch of Moscow was not there for the celebration of Nicaea, and the various jurisdictions within Orthodoxy, they're competitive. There's often nationalistic. So look, it's the Universal Patriarch in Constantinople, in what's now Istanbul. You meet with him, you agree to pray together, you remember a time of unity. That's all to the good. The reunification of the church, I think, is only something that God himself can bring about. And we can encourage that where we find opportunities. But ultimately, it's just going to, I think, I'm sorry to say this, but I think realistically, what it does is it promotes friendship. It does not promote unity.
Yeah. There was a moment, and Father, I want your thoughts on this, where, and it kind of didn't make many headlines, Pope Francis gifted Constantinople, the Patriarch there, with the relics of St. Peter during one of their visits in the past. Pope Leo wanted those relics back. So they're now being returned to the Vatican from Turkey. Your thoughts on what this means, the reclaiming of those relics of St. Peter, their bones from the tomb of St. Peter beneath the main altar in the Basilica?
Yeah, I'm surprised by that, and I'm not quite sure what the background is, because it was a sign of friendship and the sign of the unity of the Apostolic College, St. Peter, St. Andrew. But obviously, the bones of St. Peter are under the high altar of St. Peter, and the relics, to keep them there is appropriate. And if the Patriarch will give them back to Pope Leo, then that's fine. But I'm not quite sure what's going on here.
Yeah. I think it was a sign of accepting, Peter, Andrew accepting Peter. I think that was part of what this was. And for whatever reason, Pope Leo wants it in his apartment, that reliquary, which I guess was created by Paul VI. So he's taken it back. Let's move to a story from Canada that should really alarm everybody watching tonight. The Liberal government there has struck a deal with the Bloc Québécois to remove religious exemptions from Canada's hate speech laws. Bob, what are we looking at here? I mean, this seems very dangerous, depending on who defines what hate speech is.
Right. I mean, I don't believe in the concept of hate speech, by the way. I believe that there is speech which incites to violence, which ought to be controlled by the law. I don't believe in hate crimes. There are crimes, whatever they're motivated by. If you kill somebody, you kill them. I mean, and the law about murder is applied by the secular authorities. The danger here, of course, is that hate speech very, very often in North America here and in Europe these days applies to biblical principles like the marriage of one man, one woman, male and female, he created them. that homosexuality is a sin. There are cases. There's a Finnish former politician who's been taken through the courts in Finland because she quoted in a tweet or a message somewhere, maybe Facebook. I don't remember the exact place, where she mentions the teaching about homosexuality. So this sort of thing removes the protection from all different opinions and places this category of hate speech, which is an ideological category. It places it above all other considerations. And we know what happens in modern politics. I mean, maybe you get a more conservative government in and they don't apply it to Christianity, but in large part, it's applied against Christian groups. Now, it may be, and I'm not so sure about this, it may be that the Canadians are thinking that they also can use this to rein in the more radical elements of Islam, of which there are many in Canada and in the United States. But I have a feeling that this is going to the fear of Islamophobia is going to keep them away from doing that. And there is no Christophobia that is applicable in politics these days. This is going to have a terrible impact on the Christian churches.
Yeah. Father, very quickly, do you think this will affect homilies, for instance, a priest preaching on human sexuality or marriage in his parish?
Yes, they have these civil rights commissions all over Canada, which are very activist, and they go after free speech, and they call it hate speech or incitement, whatever it is. So, yeah, I'm very worried. Yeah, Canada is very comfortable, the government, that is, I don't know about the people, with an interventionist government that's now regulating what you say and think. Very dangerous.
Okay, the International Society for Civil Liberties and the Rule of Law has issued a scathing statement linking the surge in violence against Nigerian Christians directly to what it calls the Vatican's inconsistent narrative. They're specifically pointing at Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, who characterized this as essentially a dispute between herders and farmers, a social conflict rather than a religious persecution. Bob, how do you explain the Vatican's reluctance to call what many on the ground see, bishops and priests, as targeted religious persecution, if not a genocide?
Yeah, I've mentioned this before, but I think that there's a great reluctance to criticize Islam as such. And there's also a great reluctance, I think, to criticize Africans as such, because it looks like racism or, coming down on poor countries or whatever it is. But look, the Parolin, and by the way, Pope Leo repeated this himself. And I think they've been schooled by somebody to say these things. I mean, there is a conflict between these Muslim cow herders and farmers for land, obviously. And to mention that is okay, but what they keep doing is they keep diverting from the main point. Yeah. When you have probably 10,000 Christians being killed this very year, in 2025, there probably will be at least 10,000 Christians killed in Nigeria, more than in all the other countries where Christians are persecuted combined. To look at these side issues, it's true they exist, but that means you don't really want to say our people are in particular being whacked by this radical Islam, or even just everyday Islam that doesn't like Christianity. That happens as well, and therefore you're making political statements to kind of smooth things over and not protecting your own people. I'm not surprised that Inter-Society, which is a very, very good source, by the way, I quoted in my book on 21st century Catholic persecution. They're a very good, careful organization, Christian inspired, that tries to tell the truth, gets the numbers. And I think that they're quite right to say, look, we can't minimize what is an outrageous large number of Christians dying in this 21st century.
Yeah. Father, it feels like the Vatican two-step on this thing. They come out very strong on the Middle East. They find full-throated condemnation when it comes to something like deporting criminals out of the United States and people who are here illegally. But then when you have a rabid, ongoing genocide of Christians because of their Christianity, the Vatican falls silent and says, oh, it's a herding conflict.
Yeah, it's disappointing and short-sighted, to say the least, and it's not truthful. And what Bob says is true. Can you imagine any other place where 10,000 people of one religion are killed by people of another religion, and we say this is not a religious conflict. That makes no sense.
Yeah.
Reality imposes itself. That's a principle of life. So I think that's what the local bishops, and by the way, usually the Vatican defers to local hierarchies when it concerns national affairs. They should get back to do that. I mean, let's get a group of Nigerian bishops into Rome and have a meeting, and then, summon all the ambassadors of the world and say, here's why the Christian people in Nigeria are being persecuted. Listen to the people who are experiencing it.
Yeah. Pope Leo has now approved, and I want to talk about some of these reforms that are quietly happening at the Vatican. He approved and published new employment regulations for Vatican employees. Now, we're talking about everything from a minimum 36-hour work week to a 5-year term limit for leadership positions, strict anti-nepotism rules, and even requirements that senior officials submit biennial declarations confirming that they hold no asset in offshore financial centers and no stakes in companies that contradict Catholic social teaching. Now, these regulations take effect January 1st. Father, is this Leo cleaning house?
Yes, it is. It's the Pope and serious people around him. And there were serious people also in the time of Francis when this crisis came to a fore. He said, we've got to stop treating the Vatican bureaucracy involving both clerics and lay people as something that's untouchable. It needs to be reformed. And the reform is in line with modern standards of government management throughout Europe and the free world. So I think it is important. There needs to be accountability. There needs to be hiring and firing based on verified criteria. And then the money thing, there's a whole history. We know this from the Vatican leaks thing. There's a whole history of people getting jobs because they know somebody.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be that way.
Yeah. Bob, there was also, and this just broke today, there's also the story of the Pope eliminating a fundraising organization that Pope Francis had just created in February at the Holy See. I guess the economic secretariat saw some problems there in the accountability, and Pope Leo just evaporated the thing. He vanished it today.
Yeah, I think all these are good signs. I mean, certainly there's nothing in here that anybody who's just familiar with the way that you run large organizations would object to. You have these tried and proven ways of managing things, and these are good signs that he's got getting a grip on some of these neuralgic points about the Vatican that we've been talking about this for years and years.
We have.
I mean, it's almost laughable when you have movies making fun of money laundering in a place like the Vatican and connections with the mafia and all that sort of thing. No.
Yeah.
But he ran the Augustinians for a while, so he has experience running things. He's run the diocese in Peru in Chiclayo. So maybe some of that past experience where he probably had more hands-on than Francis did, or maybe Benedict ever did. Benedict certainly was a great theologian and a wonderful human being. But as an administrator, he left a certain amount to be desired. So, Look, these are good signs. A lot of these things may look like small matters to people, but these are the kind of things that make people begin to feel that there is an adult in charge. There's responsibility available in the Vatican now. To me, this is all good.
Now, more from the Vatican. This is interesting. There've been a recent spate of documents coming out, including those doctrinal notes on marriage, Una Caro, the note on Marian titles, about the co-redemptrix, the note on monogamy and polygamy. There was a study on the transmission of faith, and a highly anticipated, of course, that final document on the women's leadership in the church. All of these, according to Father Armando Mateo, who's at the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, fulfill what he calls a mandate given by the late Pope Francis. Father, Francis is gone. Leo is the sovereign pontiff now. Why is the DDF so concerned about carrying on the mandates of the previous pontificate, do you think?
Well, it's obvious that Cardinal Fernandez, who heads the Doctrine of the Faith, is interested in publishing these documents. And the fact that they published these two documents on Marian titles and on marriage as being one man, one woman, the Pope Leo agrees to put them out there. But, my question is, we're in the time of synodality. We're expecting the final reports of the 10 commissions. Now, today, we get this thing on the women's diaconate.
Yeah.
Now, the Doctrine of the Faith is going to issue more documents. We're in a time of an explosion of documents from different areas saying different things. I think it's a time to just, pause. Let's have a, sort of doctrinal office pause and say, for the next 6 months, no documents. Let's simply figure out what is going to be the strategy here. Because right now, this constant issuing of documents, it's forcing everyone to say, well, who's the voice and what's the message?
Mm-hmm.
I think we're an overload right now.
Yeah. Bob, it seems to me, Pope Leo dropped in the middle of the Jubilee year, so he was tied to all these public events, including the one in Nicaea. All of this was kind of predetermined before he ever arrived. And I think somebody convinced him that in the name of continuity, you have to continue, you have to finish the work of Francis. So he's kind of going through the motions and doing that. But around the edges, you see things starting to shift, as we mentioned in the employment standards, in the abrogation of this office that Francis set up. Do you see here Cardinal Fernandez at the DDF, trying to theologically box Leo in by issuing these documents in this way?
Well, I don't know. There have been reports that some people regard Cardinal Fernandez as accomplished a theologian as Pope Benedict was, Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was the head of the DDF, back then the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I don't see that. I mean, I look at his documents, I try to read them sympathetically, but it just seems to me that they just don't have the depth that, say, even a Cardinal Mueller would have had when he headed up that office. So, look, we don't know why Francis is having all these documents come out. We do know that he wants to give the impression, at least, of continuing in the way that Pope Francis did things, and he has given some indications of that. But look, we're looking forward in January, I think January 7th. In other words, at the end of the first week of 2026, there's going to be a consistory of the cardinals. Mm-hmm. And that, as we've mentioned before, is quite a bit different from the way that Pope Francis operated. He did have a few consistories, but they were, one at the very beginning that was very controversial, and then he didn't want to have many for a while. I think that's going to be a very interesting point. If we find out what happens then, the way he treats the cardinals, does he give them a chance to really tell him some home truths? Does he then act on it? Does he convene them again? Does he have, if real synodality is going to mean the Pope meeting more frequently with his collaborators, his cardinals, that would be a difference from the previous Pope. And I think that if he does that, we're likely to see a better balance and maybe even better decisions being made and activities being carried out in the Vatican, because then we'll be back to a church that isn't just one man making certain proclamations, which are often controversial, but the church acting as one on the key issues.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And Father, I think you'll agree with this. The new year, I think, after the Jubilee is over, with this consistory that was called very suddenly of the world's cardinals to come back to Rome at the top of the new year, Leo, it seems to me Leo will then begin to unveil his actual pontificate, because this has really been cleaning up or finishing up the Francis pontificate much of the last year. But so I want you to reflect on that and this. Yeah. There was an administrative action that was underreported, I think, last week at the Vatican, where they've possibly ended the use of Latin in administrative operations. Now, in reality, new regulations have been issued to govern Latin's use, and the new rules give flexibility to the drafting of Vatican documents in languages in addition to Latin. The dedicated Latin language office has been reinstated at the Secretariat of State. Latin does remain a liturgical language, and it continues to be the official language of the Church. But Father, this seems like one of these, again, it's the two-step. You have the option of finalizing your documents in Latin or not, but we're keeping Latin as our official language. What's really going on here?
Well, what's going on here is a recognition of what Pope Francis actually did during his pontificate. You may remember, we used to be surprised because significant documents would first come out in Italian. Yeah. And then the Latin version would be published later. Now, that practice really reflects the fact that no work is done daily in Latin. Nobody's talking Latin or writing Latin memos to each other. That's all gone. Everything is basically done in modern languages. And then an official version would be translated to Latin and then, put into the Acta, which is the official register of Vatican documents. Mm-hmm. I think we're catching up with the fact, and this is a fallout from having a vernacular liturgy. There's no reason for trained seminarians, and hasn't been since the change into the vernacular, to learn Latin. I mean, you could compel people with little sympathy for learning Latin to learn it. In order to be a priest, you need to say Mass in Latin. Now, people that want to say Mass in Latin learn it, but most don't. So I think it's a recognition of reality, and I think it's good for the church that this happened. I'll say that not just because I'm an American. English is the lingua franca of the whole world. The Pope's trip to Lebanon and Turkey, everything was in English. Mm-hmm. Nobody complained that people couldn't understand what he was saying, because that's the language people understand. Administratively, it's right. They didn't just simply come out and say modern language, Latin or English, Italian, no, they just say it's a variation. But the reality is, the longer this pontificate goes, the more business is going to be transacted in English. And I think, saying it just as an objective statement, that's good for the church.
Well, I'm going to object a little bit and throw this to Bob before we go. My take on this, Bob, is that we lose the solidity of Latin, which is not as changeable and fungible as English or other vernaculars. So it was nice to have those documents in Latin because you could cross-check them against the translations, and sometimes we found errors that way. And B, I think by diminishing Latin on the administrative side, you undermine and undercut the ancient Latin liturgy that so many are being drawn to.
Well, I hope that's not the case, Raymond. I think that by and large, this document was over-reported as somehow banishing Latin, and I don't see that at all. And I will agree with you this far, that it's important to have these documents in Latin, I believe, because we need to have authoritative texts that we can understand clearly, so that we know what we're doing as Catholics. The old joke used to be, at least, even people who weren't Catholic would say, at least Catholics know what they believe. And I know from talking with people who have actually worked on putting some of these documents into Latin, one in particular was working on the document about capital punishment, mm-hmm. and told me how they had to look for a word that didn't contradict what had happened earlier, but would say that it was inadmissible, as we're now told. Well, mm-hmm. Inadmissible is a pretty vague word, even in Latin. But look, I work in several languages. One of my books is being translated into Italian right now. There are headaches all over the place. The translator has been coming to me and saying it's driving him crazy. You need an authoritative text if you're going to go to something that that is important in the life of Christians in the world. And so there may be translations into Italian or French or English or whatnot, but to have an authoritative text in Latin gives us all a kind of North Star to navigate by. And then we can look at the translations and say, well, wait a minute, that suggests so-and-so in English, or it suggests so-and-so in French. A Latin text is an important thing, and as is a Latin liturgy.
Well, it breaks my heart to have disagreement among our posse as we leave the segment, but we'll try to bring us back together on the prayerful posse over on Arroyo Grande, where we have much more to get to, and we will this week. Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to leave it there. For commentary from Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, you can also visit thecatholicthing.org. Thank you.